In 1901, a Scottish immigrant sat in his office and made a decision that would reshape America forever. He was worth $500 million at a time when that meant something. Actually, it meant everything. The average American earned about $400 a year. He made more than that before breakfast. His name was Andrew Carnegie. Here's the uncomfortable part. Almost nobody remembers him as a businessman anymore. They remember him as a philanthropist, a giver, almost a saint. But that's not the full story. And the reason we need to talk about him right now is because he essentially invented the playbook that every billionaire uses today to stay rich while looking generous. This is how he did it. But before we look at how he gave away $300 billion, I have to give you the standard disclaimer. I am a YouTuber, not a financial advisor. I'm just a guy who reads too many history books and likes looking at big numbers. Always do your own research before investing your hard-earned money. Let's start with the baseline. Andrew Carnegie wasn't born rich. He was born poor, like actually poor. Scotland, 1835. His parents were so broke they immigrated to Pennsylvania because America was rumored to offer something novel at the time. Opportunity. His first job was threading bobbins in a textile mill. He made $1.20 a week. But Carnegie had something genetic, not kindness, ruthlessness, the kind of calculated ambition that spots a gap and exploits it without hesitation. By the time he was 30 years old, he was already wealthy. By 50, he was one of the richest men on earth. By the time he was in his mid-60s, he owned something like 80% of America's steel production. Let me repeat that. 80% of steel. This wasn't just a business. This was a stranglehold on America's infrastructure. And here's where it gets interesting. In 1901, he sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel Corporation. The sale price, $480 million. That's roughly $12 billion in today's money. But because of the specific way the deal was structured, the financial assets he controlled through stocks, bonds, and other holdings meant his actual net worth in today's dollars was closer to $350 billion. To contextualize, that's more than Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. It's more than the entire GDP of most countries. And Carnegie controlled it all at the turn of the 20th century when there was almost no income tax, no estate tax worth mentioning, and virtually zero regulation. He was untouchable, and he knew it, and that made him nervous. Here's the thing about being that wealthy in an era of rapid industrialization and labor unrest. You're not just rich. You're a target, not a metaphorical one, an actual one. By 1901, America was convulsing. Labor strikes were turning violent. Workers were organizing. The wealth gap was so obscene that even newspapers, which were owned by rich people, couldn't stop writing about it. Carnegie himself had endured the Homestead strike in 1892, a brutal confrontation at one of his steel mills that left workers dead and his reputation in tatters. He wasn't there when it happened. He was in Scotland, but he authorized the response, and America noticed. So here's what Carnegie did. He became, arguably, the first billionaire to weaponize philanthropy. Not because he suddenly found Jesus, not because he read a book about altruism, but because he understood something fundamental about power. When you're obscenely wealthy and people are angry, you don't actually have to give up your wealth. You just have to make people believe that you're using it for good. And more importantly, you have to control the narrative around how it gets used. This is the genius of what he did. And this is why we're talking about him in 2026. Carnegie started writing essays in major magazines about his philosophy of wealth. The most famous one was called The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889. And in it, he laid out an argument that sounds almost philanthropic on the surface, but was actually a masterclass in self-justification. He basically argued that it was the duty of the rich to give away their wealth during their lifetime. Not all of it. Some of it. Enough to look good. Enough to change the story about who they were. He called it a moral obligation. The implicit deal was, let me keep most of my money and my power, but let me also be the one who decides how the leftover gets distributed. Let me be the hero of my own story. And here's the catch that nobody talks about. When you give away your own money, you get to decide where it goes. You get to decide what gets built, what gets studied, what gets remembered. You get to shape civilization according to your values. You get to cement your legacy. It's not charity. It's monument building. Carnegie started building libraries. Thousands of them. Carnegie libraries. They're still standing in towns across America and the UK. Libraries are good things. Nobody's going to argue that libraries are bad. But while he was building libraries, he was also union busting. While he was donating to universities, he was lobbying to keep taxes low on his wealth. While he was bankrolling cultural institutions, he was fighting regulations that might have given workers better conditions. He was doing both things at once, the giving and the taking. But only the giving shows up in the history books. Here's where it gets really clever. Carnegie didn't just give away money. He created institutions to distribute it. The Carnegie Corporation, trusts, foundations. This wasn't random. This was infrastructure. He was building a system where philanthropic decisions wouldn't be made by elected officials or the public. They'd be made by trustees, by boards, by people chosen by Carnegie himself to think the way he thought. This allowed him to do something revolutionary. He could appear to have stepped back from control while actually ensuring that his values, his priorities, his worldview would influence America for generations. He set up endowments that would generate wealth indefinitely. Money flowing into causes he selected in perpetuity. It was a brilliant loophole because he wasn't just giving away money in 1901. He was distributing control over society's future, and he was doing it in a way that looked selfless. Think about what that means. His wealth is gone now. He died in 1919. But the institutions he funded, the preferences he encoded into those institutions, the way they shaped American culture and education and public infrastructure, that's still alive. That's still influencing decisions made today. Most people think of him as a generous man who gave away billions. And he did. But he also built a system where his philosophy would outlive him by a century, and where he'd get credit for the good it did, while bearing almost no accountability for the leverage he maintained during his lifetime. Now let's talk about the math that made this possible. Because there's a reason billionaires don't just hoard cash in vaults like Scrooge McDuck. That's not how wealth at that scale actually works. When you're as rich as Carnegie was, you don't hold your wealth in dollars. You hold it in assets, companies, real estate, securities, bonds. The value of those assets isn't just static. It compounds. It grows. It generates more wealth without you doing anything. So when Carnegie sold his company in 1901 for $480 million, he didn't get $480 million in actual cash. He got it in a combination of assets and securities. Those assets continued to appreciate. They generated dividends. They split and multiplied. And here's the key. When you give away from your accumulated wealth, you're giving away the interest, not the principal. You're giving away the earnings, not the engine that generates those earnings. So Carnegie could give away hundreds of millions of dollars over his lifetime and still die wealthier than he was when he started. The base kept growing. The compounding never stopped. This is the trick that modern billionaires have perfected. Elon Musk doesn't donate billions in cash. He donates appreciated stock. The tax benefits are enormous. He doesn't lose wealth. He gains tax advantages. Bill Gates didn't retire from Microsoft completely and live on a salary like a normal person. He maintains controlling interest while maintaining a charitable foundation. The wealth engine and the charity engine are separate. Carnegie invented this template. Literally invented it. He understood that if you're smart about how you give, you can actually consolidate power while appearing to disperse it. Here's the uncomfortable part that historians tend to skip over. Carnegie's wealth didn't come from pure genius or innovation. It came from exploitation, from workers laboring 12-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that couldn't feed their families, from union busting, from practices that would be illegal today, from political connections, from vertical integration that crushed competitors. And when those workers, exhausted and desperate, tried to organize for better conditions, Carnegie fought them, sometimes violently. The Homestead strike was one example, but it wasn't unique. It was systemic. So the mathematical question is this: how much of Carnegie's $480 million was actually earned through legitimate business acumen? And how much was extracted from workers who had no choice but to accept his terms? We don't know. But we know enough to understand that the foundation of that wealth wasn't purely from innovation or hard work. It was from an imbalance of power that favored capital over labor by an almost obscene margin. And then, once he had extracted that wealth, he became famous not for extracting it, but for giving some of it away. This is why Carnegie matters right now. Because the playbook hasn't changed. It's just gotten more sophisticated. Modern billionaires face the same problem Carnegie faced. The wealth gap is visible. It's enraging. People are asking uncomfortable questions about how that much wealth concentrated in one person actually gets created. And the answer, like it was in Carnegie's time, often involves some combination of innovation, timing, luck, and structural advantage. So what do billionaires do? They donate. They create foundations. They launch initiatives. They make sure their names are attached to universities and hospitals and cultural centers. They appear on magazine covers talking about their philanthropic dreams. And just like Carnegie, they structure those donations in ways that maintain control. They create foundations where they or their families sit on the board. They donate appreciated stock so they get tax benefits. They fund initiatives that align with their worldview while they continue to fight against the regulations that might constrain their power. The Carnegie Corporation still exists. It's still making grants. It's still shaped by values Carnegie embedded in it over a century ago. He's been dead for over 100 years, and he's still influencing how money moves through American institutions. That's power. That's not charity. And here's the thing that makes this more complicated. Philanthropy actually does good. Carnegie libraries did educate people. Universities he funded did produce knowledge. Museums he supported do exist and do matter. The problem isn't that philanthropy is useless. The problem is that it's not a substitute for systematic change. It's a supplement. It's a way of solving problems one library at a time, one grant at a time, while the structural mechanisms that created the problems in the first place remain untouched. If you give $1 million to a food bank, that's good. People eat. But it doesn't address the fact that wages in your company aren't keeping up with inflation. If you fund a school, that's good. Children learn. But it doesn't mean your company is paying its taxes fairly or that your workers have health care. Philanthropy at the scale of Carnegie or modern billionaires is something like a pressure valve. It releases enough steam to prevent an explosion, but it doesn't actually reduce the heat. The system keeps running, and the person holding the valve gets to decide when to release pressure and when to keep it closed. So here's what's strange. Andrew Carnegie is remembered as a great benefactor. If you Google him, the first thing you see is about his philanthropy. His exploitative labor practices, his union busting, his ruthlessness as a businessman. That gets mentioned, but it's secondary. It's context. The main story is about the good he did, which is a remarkable achievement because it means he successfully reframed his own life story. He took wealth extracted through structural inequality and used a portion of it to create institutions that would remember him as generous. And it worked. It worked so well that a century later, we're still treating his philanthropy as the defining characteristic of his life. That's the real power play, not the money, the narrative. The question this raises is, how much of society's infrastructure should be shaped by the private wealth and preferences of individuals, no matter how much they give away? Who decides what gets funded? Who decides what universities teach, what art gets preserved, what research gets pursued? When philanthropy is the primary mechanism for funding public goods, then the answer to those questions is the people with the most money. They become unelected architects of civilization, and they get to write the story of why they're qualified for the role. Carnegie believed that the wealthy were uniquely positioned to make those decisions, that society should trust their judgment because they had demonstrated success in making money, that a person who could build a steel empire could presumably decide what's best for education or culture or public institutions. We've inherited that assumption. It's built into how we structure foundations, how we fund universities, how we support cultural institutions. A billionaire's name on a building. A billionaire's foundation directing millions to causes they select. It's so normalized that we barely notice it anymore. But ask yourself, Would we accept that same structure in any other context? Would we allow one person, because they were wealthy, to make all the decisions about what gets built in a public space? Would we allow them to fund military decisions, healthcare decisions, criminal justice decisions? Probably not. But somehow, with philanthropy, we do. Andrew Carnegie died in 1919, relatively poorer than he had been, having given away roughly $300 million of his $480 million net worth. By all measures, he did disperse his wealth. He did fund good things, libraries and universities and research and culture. But he also structured his giving in a way that maintained his control, extended his influence, and fundamentally reframed the story of his life from exploiter to benefactor. The question that lingers is this: if Carnegie had instead supported regulations that would have limited his wealth accumulation in the first place, if he had backed labor movements and fair wages and worker protections, if he had believed that a worker's fair wages were better than a worker's access to free libraries, would history have been different? We'll never know, because that's not the choice he made, and that's not the choice most billionaires make. They keep the power to accumulate wealth, and then they spend a portion of what they accumulate to shape the story of who they are. And somehow, we keep letting them write the ending.